Picture this, the year is 800, and the Grand Cathedral in Rome glows with candlelight on Christmas night. The air hums with whispered anticipation as Pope Leo III raises a golden crown high, then places it upon the head of a towering warrior king. In that instant, the crowd erupts, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. But who was this man, this towering figure who would unite fractured kingdoms under one rule and shape the destiny of Europe itself? His name was Charlemagne, Charles the Great, a leader whose legacy is woven with equal parts brilliance and mystery, a ruler who defied the chaos of his age to forge an empire that would echo through history. What makes Charlemagne so fascinating isn't just his military conquests or his political prowess, it's the layers of contradictions that surround him. Here was a king who could wield a sword with ruthless precision, yet spent nights poring over ancient texts, laboring to revive learning in a world darkened by ignorance. A ruler who commanded absolute loyalty, yet whose own family secrets were tangled with betrayal and bloodshed. And perhaps most intriguing of all, a man crowned emperor by the church, yet whose relationship with power and faith was far more complex than the legends suggest. Was he a devout Christian king, a shrewd political strategist, or something else entirely? The answers lie buried in the shadows of the medieval world, waiting to be uncovered. This is the story of Charlemagne, not just as a historical figure, but as a living, breathing enigma. Over the next moments, we'll step into his world, tracing the footsteps of the man who dreamed of uniting Europe under a single vision. We'll explore the battles that defined him, the scholars who flocked to his court, and the whispers of intrigue that followed him even to his grave. But more than that, we'll confront the questions that still linger. What hidden ambitions drove him? What truths lie beneath the grandeur of his coronation? And how did one man's relentless will reshape the very fabric of the medieval world? The journey begins now, where history and mystery collide. Born around 742, Charlemagne entered a world of shifting alliances and brutal power struggles. His father, Pepin the Short, had carved out the Carolingian dynasty by overthrowing the last Merovingian king, a bold move that set the stage for Charlemagne's own destiny. From childhood, he was immersed in the ruthless realities of medieval kingship, learning swordplay and statecraft alongside his younger brother Carloman. But this was no ordinary sibling rivalry. The brothers were thrust into joint rule after Pepin's death in 768, inheriting a fractured kingdom where nobles constantly tested their authority. What happened next remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. Just 3 years into their uneasy co-rule, Carloman died suddenly at 20 years old officially from a nosebleed, though whispers of poison or even Charlemagne's involvement swirled through the courts. With shocking speed, Charlemagne maneuvered to claim his brother's lands, forcing Carloman's widow and infant heir to flee to the Lombard court. Was this cold calculation or political necessity? The truth vanished into the fog of time, but one thing became clear: Charlemagne would tolerate no rivals. The Europe he now faced was a patchwork of warring factions, where the memory of Rome's glory had faded into legend. Saxons raided from the north, Lombards threatened Italy, and Muslim forces pressed from Spain. Against this backdrop, Charlemagne revealed his genius not just as a warrior, but as a strategist who understood the power of symbolism. He styled himself as a new kind of Christian king, wielding faith as both sword and shield. When Pope Adrian I begged for help against the Lombards, Charlemagne didn't just defeat them. He took their iron crown for himself, positioning his dynasty as protectors of the church. Every campaign, every alliance was a calculated step toward an audacious vision, nothing less than the rebirth of empire in the West. Charlemagne's conquest of Lombardy wasn't just another military campaign. It was a masterclass in medieval power plays where faith, politics, and sheer force intertwined. The Lombards, rulers of northern Italy, had long been a thorn in the side of the papacy, encroaching on territories the Church considered its own. When Pope Adrian I found his appeals for help ignored by Constantinople, he turned north to the rising star of Europe, Charlemagne. This wasn't just a plea for protection, it was an invitation to rewrite the map of power. The Lombard king, Desiderius, had miscalculated terribly. He'd once been Charlemagne's father-in-law, forging a marriage alliance with his daughter Desiderata, a union Charlemagne shockingly annulled after just 1 year. Some historians whisper it was personal disdain. Others suspect he wanted to sever any obligation to the Lombards, clearing the path for conquest. Whatever the truth, by 773, Charlemagne's armies surged through the Alps, not just to punish Desiderius for threatening Rome, but to claim Lombardy for himself. What followed was less a war than a strategic unraveling. The fortified capital of Pavia should have held out for months, yet it fell with surprising speed. Chronicles mention secret negotiations, even rumors that Lombard nobles betrayed their king, perhaps swayed by Charlemagne's promises of wealth or titles. The Iron Crown of the Lombards, a sacred symbol of rulership forged from a nail said to be from Christ's cross, passed to Charlemagne in a ceremony thick with symbolism. By declaring himself king of the Lombards, he didn't just defeat a rival, he positioned himself as the Church's sword and shield, a bond that would culminate in that fateful coronation in Rome years later. But the real mystery lies in the aftermath. Instead of slaughtering the Lombard elite, Charlemagne integrated them into his empire, even keeping their laws intact. Was this pragmatism, recognizing that stability required local cooperation? Or was it the first glimpse of his grander vision, a patchwork empire united under his rule, where former enemies became pillars of his reign? The Lombard campaign revealed a pattern that would define Charlemagne's conquests: ruthless efficiency softened by strategic mercy, a duality that kept conquered lands from rebelling while binding them irrevocably to his growing legend. The Saxon Wars would become the defining struggle of Charlemagne's reign, a 30-year campaign so brutal even medieval chroniclers hesitated to describe its full horror. Unlike the Lombards, who bowed to political pragmatism, the Saxons clung fiercely to their pagan gods and tribal independence. Their lands stretched across dense forests and marshlands of northern Germany, a terrain where conventional warfare faltered. Charlemagne's solution, a grinding war of attrition that blended battlefield conquest with something far darker, the forced conversion of an entire people at sword point. In 772, his armies crossed into Saxony, dismantling sacred groves and smashing idols of the Saxon god Irminsul, but each victory proved fleeting. Saxon warriors, led by their elusive leader Widukind, melted into the wilderness, only to surge back in revolt the moment Charlemagne's armies withdrew. The cycle repeated for decades: conquest, rebellion, brutal reprisals. Then came the year 782 and the catastrophe at Verden. After yet another uprising, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. Was this a calculated act of terror to break Saxon resistance, or the zeal of a king who genuinely believed pagan souls must be saved even by the sword? The debate still rages. The bloodshed at Verden wasn't just a military tactic, it reshaped the rules of medieval warfare. Charlemagne's subsequent capitulary for Saxony decreed death for anyone refusing baptism or practicing pagan rites. Whole families were forcibly relocated, their children taken as hostages to be raised as Christians. Yet even this couldn't extinguish Saxon defiance. Widukind, the shadowy rebel chief, outmaneuvered Charlemagne's forces for years until a stunning twist in 785. He surrendered and accepted baptism, with Charlemagne himself standing as his godfather. Some call it a genuine change of heart, others see a desperate truce brokered by Saxon nobles weary of slaughter. What makes the Saxon Wars so unsettling is their duality. Charlemagne poured equal energy into building churches and monasteries across Saxony, importing scholars to teach the converted. He established bishoprics not just as tools of control, but as centers of learning, planting seeds for the very Carolingian Renaissance he championed. This was empire building with a missionary's fervor, where the line between enlightenment and oppression blurred beyond recognition. By the war's end in 804, Saxony stood broken yet transformed, its pagan identity erased in a fusion of blood and scripture. The cost, a legacy that still forces us to confront an uncomfortable question: can great civilizations ever be built without violence staining their foundations? The answer, like Charlemagne himself, remains shrouded in contradictions. The same hands that signed death warrants at Verden also commissioned beautiful manuscripts and debated theology with scholars. Perhaps the Saxons exposed a truth Charlemagne's other conquests masked, that his dream of a unified Christian empire demanded not just ambition, but a willingness to stare into the darkest corners of power and let history judge the consequences. Even as Charlemagne tightened his grip on Saxony, another frontier beckoned: the Iberian Peninsula. In 778, he led an expedition south across the Pyrenees, answering a plea from Muslim rebels in Zaragoza who promised to betray their emir in exchange for Frankish support. But this campaign would unravel in ways no one foreseen, leaving behind not just military failure, but the seeds of one of history's most enduring legends. The march into Spain began with promise. Charlemagne's forces swept through Navarre, securing pledges of loyalty from local Christian communities. Yet when they reached Zaragoza, the city's gates remained shut. The promised betrayal had evaporated. Facing scorching summer heat and stretched supply lines, the Franks turned back north. That's when disaster struck, as the rearguard, led by Charlemagne's nephew Roland, traversed the narrow Roncevaux Pass. Basque warriors launched a devastating ambush from the cliffs above. The royal Frankish annals tersely note the slaughter: a handful of nobles killed, baggage train plundered. But over centuries, this obscure skirmish would transform into something far grander in the collective imagination. The legend crystallized in the Song of Roland, written 3 centuries later. Here, the Basques morph into a vast Muslim army, outnumbering Roland's men by thousands. The poem paints Roland as the perfect knight, brave to the point of recklessness. With his dying breath, he blows his oliphant horn with such force that the veins in his temples burst, summoning Charlemagne's distant army too late. That horn, oliphant, becomes a symbol of tragic heroism, its blast echoing across medieval literature. But how much of this reflects reality? Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. A weathered 9th century rock inscription near Roncevaux reads, "In memoria Retlandi," a proof Roland's name was revered there soon after his death. Yet the historical Roland likely wasn't the prefect of Brittany as later tales claim, but a minor lord whose death gained mythic weight. The horn's legend is even murkier. No contemporary source mentions it. Some scholars suggest it evolved from Viking war trumpets, while others see a metaphor for Roland's unheeded warnings. What makes Roncevaux so haunting is how a minor military setback became a cornerstone of European identity. The real tragedy wasn't the ambush itself, but how Charlemagne's vision of a Christian Spain crumbled in its wake. For decades afterward, the Pyrenees became a bloody no-man's land, with Frankish outposts like Barcelona barely holding on. Yet from this failure sprang something unexpected, a story so potent it outshone the facts. Roland's legend, embroidered with sacrifice and cosmic resonance, gave medieval Europe a martyr to rally around, turning a tactical retreat into an eternal song of defiance. Perhaps that's the ultimate irony. Sometimes defeat writes history more powerfully than victory. The bloodless annexation of Bavaria in 787 remains one of Charlemagne's most puzzling power plays. A conquest achieved without drawn swords or burnt villages, yet dripping with unspoken menace. For decades, Duke Tassilo III had ruled Bavaria as a semi-independent kingdom, marrying a Lombard princess and even allying with the Avars against Frankish interests. By all accounts, he should have been Charlemagne's next great adversary. So why did he kneel without a fight? The truth lies in the shadowy interplay of family, faith, and fear. Tassilo wasn't just any rival, he was Charlemagne's own cousin, bound by blood yet estranged by ambition. Earlier in his reign, Tassilo had sworn oaths of loyalty to Charlemagne, only to break them repeatedly, playing a dangerous game of shifting alliances. But by the late 700s, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Charlemagne's recent victories crushing the Lombards, pacifying Saxony, left Bavaria encircled. Worse still, the Church had become Charlemagne's willing weapon. At the Synod of Worms in 781, bishops branded Tassilo a traitor for abandoning a campaign against the Saxons years earlier. Excommunication loomed, stripping him of divine legitimacy. Then came the masterstroke. Charlemagne summoned Tassilo to an assembly at Ingelheim in 787, not with an army at his back but with a choir of clergymen. Facing accusations of oath-breaking and threats of eternal damnation, the Duke crumpled. Some chroniclers claim he wept as he surrendered his lands, his titles, even his own sons as hostages. But was this really just about broken promises? Hidden beneath the surface were darker currents. Rumors swirled that Tassilo's Lombard wife, Liutperga, had urged resistance only to be isolated by Charlemagne's spies. Others whisper of secret bribes to Bavarian nobles, ensuring no support remained for their duke. Most chilling of all, Tassilo may have known what happened to rebels who defied Charlemagne outright. The memory of the Saxon massacre at Verden was fresh, and the fate of the Lombard royal family exiled to monasteries served as a grim warning. What makes Bavaria's fall so fascinating is what followed. Unlike the Saxons, Bavarians faced no mass executions or forced conversions. Charlemagne preserved their laws, even keeping Tassilo's administration intact for a time. But within months, the Duke and his family vanished into monastic prisons, their names scrubbed from records. It was a quieter form of annihilation, one that left no bloodstains but shattered a dynasty just as completely. This was Charlemagne's genius. He understood that power wasn't just taken by the sword, but by controlling the narrative itself. By casting Tassilo as an oath-breaker, he turned a naked land grab into righteous justice. The Church's role proved pivotal here. Faith wasn't just a spiritual shield for Charlemagne, but a political crowbar, prying apart resistance without a single battle. Bavaria became a blueprint for his later expansions, a mix of implied threat, staged legitimacy, and the quiet erasure of those who dared oppose him. Yet the question lingers, did Tassilo surrender out of weakness, or was he outmaneuvered by a cousin who played the Game of Thrones better than anyone? The answer lies in the silence of the archives, where the whispers of the defeated rarely survive. What remains undeniable is this: in the annexation of Bavaria, Charlemagne proved that sometimes the most enduring conquests leave no scars on the land, only on history's memory. The coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day in the year 800 was no ordinary ceremony. It was a seismic moment that sent shockwaves through the medieval world. As the golden crown touched his brow in St. Peter's Basilica, 3 centuries of tradition shattered in an instant. No barbarian king had held the title of Roman emperor since the fall of the West in 476. But was this a divine appointment or a calculated power grab? The answer depends on who you ask and which chronicler you trust. Byzantine historians paint the scene as pure political theater. The Annals Maximini claim Pope Leo III acted unilaterally, springing the crown on an unsuspecting Charlemagne to bind him to the papacy's survival. Leo had reason to be desperate. Just 2 years earlier, Roman nobles had attacked him during a procession, slashing his eyes and tongue in a failed mutilation meant to disqualify him from office. Charlemagne's forces restored him, but at what cost? Some Byzantine sources whisper the Pope owed his throne to Frankish swords, and the coronation was his repayment. Yet Frankish chronicles tell a different story. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer and confidant, insists his master was furious at the coronation, grumbling he wouldn't have entered the church had he known the Pope's plan. But this rings hollow when you examine the meticulous staging. The ceremony coincided with Charlemagne's arrival in Rome after suppressing yet another rebellion, timing too perfect to be accidental. Even more telling, he'd spent years cultivating imperial symbolism, renovating Roman palaces, minting coins with classical motifs, and hosting scholars who referred to his realm as an imperium long before 800. The truth likely lies in the shadows between these accounts. Leo needed a protector strong enough to shield the papacy from Byzantine interference and local uprisings. Charlemagne craved legitimacy beyond his Frankish crown, especially with Constantinople's Empress Irene ruling alone, a scenario medieval minds saw as unnatural. Their mutual interests collided in that candlelit moment, but the coronation's brilliance hides its awkward reality. Protocols crumbled under the weight of improvisation. No Byzantine emperor had ever been crowned by a pope. Tradition demanded the Senate acclaim a ruler in Constantinople. Charlemagne's awkward title, Emperor of the Romans, deliberately avoided claiming direct succession from Byzantium's rulers. When envoys from Irene proposed marriage to unite the empires, Charlemagne entertained the idea until her overthrow in 802, proof he saw his new status as negotiable. What makes this coronation so endlessly debated isn't just the question of surprise, but its revolutionary implications. By placing the crown on Charlemagne himself, Leo asserted the papacy's power to anoint secular rulers, a precedent that would haunt Europe for centuries. Yet Charlemagne never returned to Rome for future Christmases, preferring his palace at Aachen. Perhaps the greatest irony, the man crowned as Rome's heir built his capital in Germania, far from the Tiber's banks, proving even history's most calculated moments can spiral beyond anyone's control. Charlemagne's court glittered with power and prestige, but beneath the gold and tapestries festered whispers of betrayal, none more shocking than the revolt of his own son, Pepin the Hunchback. Born to Charlemagne's first wife, Himiltrude, Pepin's physical deformity made him an unlikely heir, yet his intellect burned bright. By 792, the young prince had become a pawn in a deadly game. Noblemen disgruntled by Charlemagne's reforms, men who chafed under his centralized rule, coaxed Pepin into leading a coup. The plot unraveled with brutal efficiency. Chroniclers describe a midnight interrogation in the royal chapel at Regensburg, where conspirators named names under torture. Pepin's fate, exiled to a remote monastery, his name scrubbed from official records. But the real mystery lingers. Was this truly a son's ambition, or a manufactured crisis that allowed Charlemagne to purge dissenters under the guise of family drama? The shadows deepen when we examine Charlemagne's marriages, each ending under a cloud of suspicion. His second wife, Desiderata of Lombardy, was discarded within a year, possibly poisoned by political enemies who opposed the Lombard alliance. Fastrada, his fourth queen, died suddenly in 794 after suppressing a rebellion with uncharacteristic cruelty, prompting rumors she'd been given something bitter by vengeful nobles. Even his beloved third wife, Hildegard, perished young after bearing 9 children, her health mysteriously failing after a pilgrimage. Medieval biographers tiptoe around these deaths, but the pattern is unmistakable. Charlemagne's bedchamber was as dangerous as any battlefield. Then there's the puzzle of his daughters, radiant, educated women who remained unwed despite countless suitors. Rotrud, Bertha, Gisela, their names grace poems and illuminated manuscripts, yet none took a husband. Some historians claim Charlemagne couldn't bear to share their political acumen, keeping them as advisors and confidantes. Others suggest darker motives, preventing rival dynasties from gaining Carolingian bloodlines. The most tantalizing theory comes from the monk Notker the Stammerer, who hints the princesses had unofficial relationships with courtiers, their children quietly absorbed into noble families. Whatever the truth, their unmarried status wasn't mere paternal affection. It was a calculated move in the chess game of dynastic power. What emerges from these scandals isn't just a portrait of a fractured family, but a ruler who understood the lethal algebra of control. Every rebellion crushed, every marriage severed, every daughter kept close. These weren't personal failures, but deliberate strategies to concentrate authority. Charlemagne's court, for all its splendor, operated under one iron law. No threat, whether from blood or blade, could be allowed to undermine the empire he'd built. The cost, a legacy where love and loyalty always bowed to the unforgiving calculus of power. At the heart of Charlemagne's empire stood Aachen, a city that defied the darkness of its age. Unlike the crumbling ruins of Rome or the fractured courts of rival kings, Aachen pulsed with ambition, a gleaming testament to one man's vision of renewal. Charlemagne didn't just build a palace here, he crafted a stage for his grandest performance. The centerpiece was his octagonal chapel, its domed ceiling studded with golden mosaics designed to rival Byzantium's Hagia Sophia. But beneath the marble floors and shimmering altars lay secrets, a labyrinth of underground tunnels, their purpose lost to time. Were they escape routes for a paranoid king? Sacred passageways for clandestine rituals, or simply the practical work of engineers channeling the city's famous thermal springs? The stones refused to tell. Then came the fire. In 810, flames erupted in the palace complex, devouring entire wings, including the fabled library where Charlemagne hoarded ancient texts. The royal Frankish annals mention the disaster in a single line, but the silence speaks volumes. Lost were manuscripts painstakingly copied by monks, perhaps even original works from antiquity. Some scholars suggest the blaze wasn't accidental. Charlemagne's court teemed with factions, clergy resentful of his control, nobles scheming against his reforms. Could the fire have been a warning or an attempt to erase the very knowledge he sought to preserve? Yet from these ashes rose something extraordinary, the Carolingian Renaissance. Aachen became a magnet for Europe's greatest minds. The scholar Alcuin of York redesigned education, creating a curriculum that blended scripture with classical logic. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, penned his life of Charlemagne here, shaping the emperor's legend for centuries. Scribes perfected a new, legible script, Carolingian minuscule, that would become the foundation of modern European writing. But the most enigmatic treasures were the cryptic manuscripts like the Lorsch Gospels, their jeweled covers hiding celestial diagrams and coded marginalia. Were these mere decoration or maps to some deeper esoteric truth? What made Aachen unique wasn't just its splendor, but its contradictions. This was a court where warriors fresh from Saxon bloodshed debated Aristotle with clerics, where the scent of parchment mingled with the iron tang of weapons. Charlemagne himself, often depicted in a simple woolen tunic, would stride from theological disputations to inspect construction progress, his hands equally comfortable turning pages or gripping a sword. The palace's very layout reflected this duality. Chapels and scriptoriums adjoined armories and stables, as if to declare that empire building required both the pen and the spear. The mysteries of Aachen linger in its fragments. A single surviving palace wall, the Granus Tower, stands as a silent witness. The thermal baths where Charlemagne soaked his aging bones still bubble beneath the city, their steam whispering of a king who sought to channel Rome's glory while forging something entirely new. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of this place, that even in an age of violence and superstition, light could flicker stubbornly against the dark, thanks to a ruler audacious enough to believe he could rekindle the fires of civilization itself. Charlemagne's religious reforms reveal a ruler who wielded faith like a double-edged sword, cutting away dissent while cloaking political ambitions in divine mandate. Take the enforcement of uniform liturgy, Across his empire, from the bustling markets of Aachen to the remote Saxon outposts, every church was ordered to adopt the Roman rite. On the surface, this was pure piety, a king ensuring his subjects worshipped correctly. But dig deeper and another motive emerges. By standardizing prayer, Charlemagne didn't just unite Christians, he erased regional variations that could foster local loyalties. The message was clear: spiritual authority flowed from Rome, yes, but only through him, the emperor who now controlled access to the sacred. Then came the crackdown on the adoptionist heresy. This obscure theological debate centered on whether Christ was the biological son of God or merely his adopted heir, might seem like monk squabbles. Yet Charlemagne treated it as an existential threat. In 792, he summoned bishops to the Council of Regensburg, where Spanish clerics promoting adoptionism were forced to recant or face exile. The trial records are chilling in their precision, phrases like corrupted doctrine and danger to souls masking what was really at stake. Adoptionism had flourished in the borderlands of Spain, where local rulers resisted Frankish influence. Crushing it wasn't just about theological purity, it was about silencing a movement that could rally resistance under the banner of faith. But the darkest whispers surround the fate of those who opposed these reforms. Bishop Felix of Urgell, the most prominent adoptionist, vanished into monastic confinement after his trial. Chroniclers mention his repentance, yet his later writings mysteriously disappear from the archives. Even more telling is the case of clerics in Bavaria who resisted the new liturgy. Letters from the period hint at sudden reassignments to frontier monasteries, places where rebellious voices tended to fall silent. Were these men victims of routine discipline or casualties of Charlemagne's unspoken policy? That dissent, once uncovered, must be permanently removed. The grand irony: this emperor who policed orthodoxy so ruthlessly harbored his own unorthodox habits. He kept 4 wives consecutively, technically bigamy by church standards, and flouted fasting laws when it suited him. Even his beloved scholar Alcuin gently chided him for ignoring clerical celibacy decrees. The disconnect speaks volumes. Charlemagne's religious zeal wasn't about personal devotion but control. Every liturgy standardized, every heretic purged, was another thread woven into the tapestry of his imperial authority, a tapestry where the cross and the crown were inseparable. What lingers isn't just the question of motives, but the fingerprints left on history itself. The very manuscripts that preserve these events were copied by monks under Charlemagne's patronage, their pages subtly edited to cast his actions in providential light. In the end, his religious reforms succeeded not because they were divinely inspired, but because he understood a truth few rulers of his age grasped. To shape an empire, you must first shape the way its people believe. In the winter of 811, as Charlemagne felt the weight of his 70 years pressing upon him, he summoned scribes to draft a document that would baffle historians for centuries: his last will and testament. Unlike the orderly divisions typical of Frankish royalty, this was no straightforward partition. The emperor, who had spent decades forging a unified empire through blood and faith, chose to fracture his life's work into unequal fragments. His eldest son, Charles the Younger, received the core Frankish heartlands. Louis, the devout third son, inherited Aquitaine and a swath of southern territories. But the real shock lay in the omission. Pepin, Charlemagne's middle son and namesake of his legendary father, was granted only Italy, a prize already diminished by years of Frankish control. What appeared on parchment as mere inheritance was, in truth, a puzzle wrapped in vellum. The uneven distribution defied logic. By Frankish tradition, realms were split equally among heirs to prevent jealousy. Yet Charlemagne's will deliberately unbalanced the scales, leaving Charles with far greater resources and prestige. Some historians argue this was pragmatism, a recognition that only one son, Charles, had the martial prowess to defend the empire's borders. Others detect a darker calculus. Pepin's Italian lands were geographically isolated, surrounded by loyal Frankish vassals who could contain any ambition. Louis, though pious, was politically inexperienced, his southern holdings a buffer against Muslim incursions from Spain. Every provision seemed designed to ensure no single heir could challenge the others without catastrophic risk. But the document's true enigma lies in its timing. Drafted 3 years before Charlemagne's death, the will coincided with two ominous events: the sudden passing of Pepin of Italy in 810 and a near-fatal accident involving Charles the Younger during a boar hunt. Was the emperor anticipating dynastic chaos? The text itself offers eerie clues. Amidst land divisions, Charlemagne inserted a bizarre clause demanding his wealth be melted into coins and scattered to the poor, a gesture echoing Christ's betrayal price of 30 pieces of silver. Was this a coded admission of guilt or a symbolic attempt to cleanse his legacy? The most chilling interpretation suggests the will wasn't a plan for peace, but a blueprint for collapse. Charlemagne, schooled in history, knew the Carolingian dynasty's weakness lay in its dependence on a single ruler's strength. By engineering controlled instability, he may have sought to force his sons into either collaboration or confrontation, ensuring only the most capable survived to reunite the empire. It's a theory bolstered by his earlier actions, how he'd crushed his own brother's line to secure power. Perhaps he believed only through fire could his legacy endure. Yet the will's final twist defied even his designs. When Charles the Younger died months after his father in 814, Louis the Pious inherited everything by default. The empire remained intact, but under a ruler whose piety outpaced his political cunning. Within a generation, the Carolingian realm would splinter irrevocably at the Treaty of Verden. Charlemagne's cryptic will, rather than preventing chaos, became its unwitting catalyst, proof that even history's greatest architects cannot control the storms seeded by their own hands. The Carolingian dynasty's greatest weakness wasn't foreign enemies or rebellions. It was the cruel twist of fate that seemed to stalk Charlemagne's heirs. Within 4 years of his death, the emperor's carefully laid succession plans lay in ruins, his lineage ravaged by a string of tragedies so relentless, contemporaries whispered of divine punishment. First came the blow in 810 when Pepin of Italy, the middle son who'd governed Rome's former heartland with surprising skill, succumbed to a fever at just 33. Chroniclers noted his sudden collapse after hosting Lombard nobles at a feast, sparking theories of poison. But the real horror unfolded months later when Charles the Younger, the brawny heir apparent, rode into a forest near Regensburg for a routine boar hunt. What should have been a display of royal prowess turned to catastrophe when his horse stumbled, crushing him beneath its weight. The annals of Fulda describe the scene with grim simplicity. The hope of the Franks perished in an instant. Behind these tragedies lurked unsettling patterns. Both brothers died at the peak of their vitality, Pepin in the prime of his rule, Charles mere months before he was to inherit the imperial crown. Their deaths cleared the path for Louis the Pious, the bookish third son whose monastic upbringing had made him an unlikely successor. Coincidence? Some medieval chroniclers didn't think so. The monk Adhemar of Chabons later claimed a curse befell the Carolingians after Charlemagne ordered the execution of Saxon hostages, their dying cries invoking wrath upon his bloodline. Modern historians probe darker possibilities. Pepin's illness bore hallmarks of arsenic poisoning, a favored tool of medieval assassins. His court in Pavia had been a snake pit of Lombard resentment, where noble families displaced by Frankish rule waited for revenge. Charles's hunting accident raises equal suspicions. Boar hunts were tightly controlled rituals. For a seasoned rider to die in one suggests sabotage. Was his saddle strap cut, his horse drugged? The official records fall suspiciously silent. The most chilling theory implicates Louis himself. Though later revered as the Pious, his early reign saw purges of officials loyal to his brothers. A letter from Archbishop Agobard of Lyons hints at courtiers who disappeared like morning mist after questioning the succession. Louis's wife, Ermengarde, was said to despise Charles, openly celebrating his death as divine favor. Yet without evidence, these remain whispers, the kind that thrive in history's shadowy corners. What makes these deaths so haunting isn't just the mystery, but their consequences. With Pepin and Charles gone, Louis inherited an empire he was ill-equipped to defend. His piety led him to divide the realm among his own sons, triggering civil wars that would shatter Charlemagne's hard-won unity. The Carolingian collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the result of a generational curse, whether supernatural or man-made, that erased the very heirs who might have sustained their father's vision. In the end, the dynasty's fate mirrored the emperor's own rise, built on the graves of kin. The glittering courts of Aachen and Constantinople circled each other like wary panthers, their diplomacy laced with equal parts silk and steel. When Charlemagne accepted the imperial title from Pope Leo in 800, it wasn't just the Saxons or Lombards who bristled. It was Empress Irene of Byzantium, the formidable woman who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from its gilded capital. By ancient tradition, there could be only one true heir to Rome's legacy, and Irene's envoys made it clear. Charlemagne's coronation was an insult, a barbarian's pretension. Yet beneath the public frost lay a far stranger story, one of clandestine overtures, vanished messengers, and a marriage proposal that could have reshaped Europe's map. Irene's reign was already legendary. She'd seized power after blinding her own son, Constantine VI, in the very chamber where he was born, an act so brutal even Byzantine chroniclers shuddered. Yet for all her ruthlessness, she faced a precarious dilemma. Byzantium's military was stretched thin, battling Bulgars and Arabs, leaving her vulnerable to Charlemagne's growing influence. Then came the surprise overture. In 802, whispers reached Aachen of a staggering offer. Irene proposed marriage, uniting their empires under a single crown. The implications were earth-shaking. If Charlemagne agreed, he'd gain legitimacy in Byzantine eyes, transforming his barbarian title into undisputed sovereignty. But was this truly diplomacy or a poisoned chalice? Some historians believe Irene's offer was a feint, a way to lure Charlemagne into the treacherous waters of Byzantine court politics, where assassination by perfumed handkerchief or tainted wine was routine. The royal Frankish annals note that envoys from both courts vanished during negotiations, their bodies never found. One particularly cryptic entry mentions a Byzantine ambassador found dead in Venice, clutching a sealed letter that burst into flames when touched by priests. Whether fact or folklore, the message was clear. Trust between these rulers was as fragile as parchment. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the dance collapsed. In 802, Irene was overthrown by her finance minister, Nicephorus, a coup so swift, Charlemagne's spies allegedly learned of it weeks after the fact. With her went any hope of union. Nicephorus scorned the marriage talks, dismissing Charlemagne as a Frank in a stolen crown. Yet the mystery lingers. Did Irene's fall doom the alliance, or was it doomed from the start? A recently discovered letter in a monastic archive hints at darker forces. Penned by a Byzantine exile, it claims Irene's own advisors secretly sabotaged the negotiations, fearing a union would dilute their power. What makes this shadow play so compelling is how it reveals Charlemagne's limitations. For all his battlefield triumphs, he couldn't crack Byzantium's labyrinthine court. His response to Nicephorus's insults, not invasion but a peculiar silence broken only years later when he gifted the new emperor a pack of rare hunting dogs. Was this a peace offering or a veiled threat, reminding Byzantium that even the mightiest rulers could be brought to heel? The dogs, like so much in this tale, left no answers. Perhaps the final irony lies in what didn't happen. Had Irene's marriage offer succeeded, Europe might have seen a reunified Roman Empire centuries before the Renaissance dreamed of it. Instead, the schism deepened, setting east and west on divergent paths that would echo through the Crusades and beyond. In the end, the real tragedy wasn't the spies or the scheming, it was the road not taken, a fleeting chance for unity lost in the murky waters of ambition and distrust. Even at the height of his power, Charlemagne couldn't escape the whispers of fate, especially when longships with dragon-prowed bows began slipping up his rivers like specters from a nightmare. The first Viking raid struck the Frisian coast in 800, a lightning strike against undefended monasteries rich with gold and relics, but this was no ordinary pillaging. The attackers moved with chilling precision, vanishing before Frankish troops could respond, leaving behind smoldering chapels and traumatized survivors. When news reached Charlemagne at his palace in Aachen, witnesses claimed the emperor buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with uncharacteristic tears. Why would Europe's most formidable warrior king weep over a handful of coastal skirmishes? The answer lies in what he saw that others didn't, a pattern as inevitable as the tide. These weren't just opportunistic pirates. The Vikings targeted holy sites with eerie focus, as if mocking the Christian empire Charlemagne had built. Lindisfarne's sacking in 793 had been dismissed as a distant tragedy, but Frisia was Frankish soil, a brazen challenge to imperial authority. Worse, the raiders exploited weaknesses Charlemagne knew all too well: sluggish mobilization across his vast territories, rival nobles reluctant to share troops, and coastlines stretched too thin to guard. His tears, then, may have been those of a strategist realizing his system's fatal flaw. Yet some chronicles hint at something darker. Einhard recounts a strange prophecy. Sailors in the north spoke of a king so mighty, his death would unleash chaos from the sea. Charlemagne, ever superstitious, reportedly dreamed of Viking invasions months before they occurred, visions so vivid they left him pacing his chambers at night. Whether coincidence or curse, the timing was ominous. The raids began just as his health faltered, his once indomitable body now racked by fevers and joint pain. To a ruler who believed God anointed his reign, the longship's arrival might have felt less like an invasion than a divine reckoning, the ultimate irony. Charlemagne's own policies may have spurred the Viking Age. His Saxon Wars displaced entire communities, pushing Norse traders toward raiding. His coinage system concentrated wealth in monasteries, perfect targets for seafaring bandits. Even his famed conquests backfired. By crushing rival kingdoms like the Avars, he removed buffers that once kept Scandinavian warbands in check. The tears shed at Aachen, then, could have been for the unintended consequences of his own ambition, a realization that every empire sows the seeds of its own decline. What makes this moment so haunting isn't the raids themselves, but their symbolism. The Vikings didn't just bring axes, they carried the future. Their hit-and-run tactics foreshadowed the feudal fragmentation that would cripple Charlemagne's heirs, their ships a grim preview of the porous borders that would dissolve his hard-won unity. In those first flickers of fire along the coast, the emperor glimpsed the truth. No wall, no army, no crown could hold back the tide of change. His tears were the price of prophecy, the cost of seeing too clearly what others dared not imagine. The winter of 814 clamped icy fingers around Aachen as Charlemagne, now 71 years old, felt the weight of his years pressing down. For months, he'd been plagued by fevers that even the palace's thermal springs couldn't soothe. Then, on January 28th, the emperor who had reshaped Europe took his final breath, not on a battlefield or in some grand ceremony, but quietly in his bed, surrounded by murmuring clerics. According to his biographer Einhard, Charlemagne's last act was to trace the sign of the cross on his forehead, a fitting end for a ruler who had spent his life balancing faith with the sword, or so it seemed. His burial in Aachen's chapel was swift, almost furtive. No grand procession, no empire-wide mourning. The man who had been crowned emperor with such fanfare was laid to rest with startling simplicity. The tomb itself was a marvel, a golden sarcophagus adorned with scenes of his conquests, placed precisely beneath the dome where he'd once prayed. Yet for all its splendor, something felt incomplete. Even as his son Louis took the throne, whispers began. Had Charlemagne truly died a saint, or was there something more complicated beneath the golden veneer? The answer, it turns out, would take 2 centuries to unravel. Despite his fervent promotion of Christianity, Charlemagne wasn't officially canonized until 1165, an astonishing delay that still puzzles historians. The official reason: church scholars claimed there was insufficient proof of miracles during his lifetime, but the truth might lie in the shadows of his reign. His forced conversions of the Saxons, his tangled marital history, even his coronation's political maneuvering, all of it left a legacy too controversial for swift sainthood. It wasn't until Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, desperate to legitimize his own imperial ambitions, pushed for the canonization that the Vatican finally relented. Then came the moment that would haunt medieval chronicles, the year 1000, when Emperor Otto III ordered Charlemagne's tomb opened. What he found defied explanation. The accounts read like something from a ghost story. There, seated upright on a marble throne, was Charlemagne's corpse, crowned with gold, scepter in hand, his fingernails having grown through his gloves to pierce the fabric. The air reportedly smelled not of decay but of spices and sanctity. Otto, awestruck, allegedly removed a single tooth from the skeleton as a relic before resealing the tomb. Was this a miracle proving Charlemagne's sanctity, or something more unsettling? Modern historians offer grimmer theories. The seated position could have been the result of an improperly secured sarcophagus collapsing over time, propping the body upright. The grown fingernails, likely the leather gloves shrinking as they decomposed, giving the illusion of elongation. Even the sweet smell might be explained by the lavish spices used in medieval embalming. Yet none of this dampens the eerie power of the story. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Charlemagne's death and afterlife. Even in rest, he refused to conform, too warrior-like for immediate sainthood, too enigmatic for simple explanations. His tomb became a mirror, reflecting whatever each generation needed to see. A saint for the Middle Ages, a political symbol for the Renaissance, a cautionary tale for modern scholars. The man who had spent his life crafting his legend ensured, perhaps unintentionally, that it would never truly end. And so he remains, half emperor, half saint, forever frozen between history and myth, waiting for the next hand to lift the lid and decide his fate anew. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen is far more than a grand monument to Charlemagne's power. It's a riddle carved in stone, its walls whispering secrets few modern eyes can decipher. At first glance, the chapel's octagonal design echoes Byzantine grandeur, a tribute to Ravenna's San Vitale, but look closer and the geometry reveals something stranger. The number 8 wasn't chosen for aesthetics alone. In early Christian mysticism, 8 symbolized rebirth and resurrection, the 7 days of creation plus a new beginning. Some scholars argue the chapel's dimensions encode celestial alignments, with its pillars marking solstice sunbeams that strike specific carvings on sacred dates. Then there's the throne, Charlemagne's marble seat, positioned precisely on the upper gallery's west side, aligns with the setting sun on his coronation date, Christmas Day. Coincidence, or a silent proclamation that this Frankish king claimed not just earthly power, but a divine mandate woven into the very stones? Beneath the golden mosaics, stranger symbols lurk. The bronze wolf head door handles, their muzzles worn smooth by centuries of hands, are no ordinary decorations. Wolves were sacred to the Merovingians, Charlemagne's shadowy predecessors, often linked to their mythic founder Merovich, said to be born of a sea creature. Folklore claims the handles grow warm to the touch when danger approaches the realm. Legend Charlemagne's courtiers may have encouraged to unsettle visiting nobles. Even more enigmatic are the chapel's hidden acrostics. Latin inscriptions along the dome's base, when read in sequence, spell out a cryptic warning. Rex a solis ortu usque ad occasum laudabilis nomen ius. The king's name is praiseworthy from sunrise to sunset. But rearrange certain letters, and alternate meanings emerge, possible references to the lost sorts Merovingici, ancient divination texts the Merovingians used to prophecy. Then there's the matter of the labyrinth. Beneath the chapel's floor lies a network of tunnels, long sealed but glimpsed in medieval repair records. These weren't mere service passages. Excavations in the 1950s revealed walls lined with odd carving, serpents swallowing their tails, interlocking triangles, a stag with 12 tines encircled by stars. Parallels to Merovingian burial art are unmistakable, particularly the stag, a symbol of the dynasty's claimed descent from the god Cernunnos. Most baffling is a chamber beneath the altar, its ceiling etched with constellations as they appeared not in Charlemagne's era, but in the year 496, the very year Clovis, first Christian Merovingian king, was baptized. Was this a hidden nod to the bloodline Charlemagne had supplanted, a silent plea for legitimacy from the dynasty he'd erased? The chapel's crowning mystery orbits its most famous relic, the ancient Roman sarcophagus Charlemagne allegedly repurposed for his own burial. Decorated with a relief of Persephone's abduction into the underworld, it seems an odd choice for a Christian emperor until you consider the whispers. Some medieval chronicles insist the coffin wasn't empty when found. They speak of a skeleton clad in a crumbling purple robe, clutching a jeweled scepter and a lead scroll. The scroll, if it existed, vanished long ago, but 12th century monks copied a fragment claiming it bore the words "Transit umbra, lux permanet," the shadow passes, the light remains. A Merovingian motto, some say, hinting at occult knowledge passed secretly to Charlemagne's line. Others dismiss it as romantic fabrication. Yet the question lingers, why would history's most meticulous ruler, a man who standardized liturgy and law, choose a pagan sarcophagus unless it carried meaning only a select few could understand? Perhaps the truth lies in the chapel's contradictions. Here, Christian crosses twine with pagan geometries, imperial Latin conceals older incantations, and every symbol serves dual purposes: public piety and private code. Charlemagne didn't just build a chapel, he constructed a cipher, one that balanced his thirst for the future with an unspoken debt to the past. To walk its corridors is to tread the knife's edge between faith and power, between the empire he built and the mysteries he may have buried. Among the treasures of Charlemagne's legend, none shines, or cuts quite like Joyeuse, the sword whispered to hold a fragment of the lance of Longinus, the very spear that pierced Christ's side at Calvary. Glimpsed in tapestries and chronicles, this blade supposedly glowed with divine light, could blind enemies with a single flash, and never dulled despite countless battles. But how much of this is history, and how much is the myth-making of later centuries? The truth, much like the sword itself, is layered beneath centuries of embellishment. The earliest reliable accounts place Joyeuse in Charlemagne's hand during his coronation in 800, its golden hilt catching the candlelight as he swore to defend Christendom. Medieval scribes, ever eager to sanctify their heroes, soon wove fantastical origins for the weapon. Some claimed it was forged from the same steel as Roland's Durendal and Arthur's Excalibur, its pommel holding a thorn from Christ's crown. The most audacious legend insisted the smith who crafted it plunged the blade into the lance of Longinus itself, embedding holy power in its core. Yet Charlemagne's own biographer, Einhard, never mentions these miracles, only that the emperor carried a prized sword named Joyeuse, its value tied more to symbolism than sorcery. The sword's alleged rediscovery in the 13th century only deepens the enigma. A gilded saber, now displayed in the Louvre, was proclaimed to be Joyeuse after it surfaced in a French monastery. But the dates don't align. Carbon testing reveals the metalwork matches the 10th or 11th century, long after Charlemagne's death. Even its famed unbreakable quality crumbles under scrutiny. Conservators note repairs to the blade, evidence of battles it didn't survive unscathed. So why the fervent belief? Because Joyeuse had become more than steel. It was a relic of kingship. French monarchs from Philip III onward wielded it in coronations, tying their legitimacy to Charlemagne's legacy. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue lies in the Abbey of Saint Denis, where chroniclers insist the real Joyeuse rested for centuries. During the French Revolution, rioters looted the abbey's treasures, melting down golden hilts and scattering sacred artifacts. Did the sword survive in some shadowed crypt, or was it reduced to ingots, its legacy preserved only in stories? The answer may lie in a cryptic note from a revolutionary official, mentioning a long, curved blade smuggled away by royalists, a description mismatched with medieval depictions of Joyeuse as a straight broadsword. What endures isn't just the mystery of the sword's fate, but what its legends reveal about how power is crafted. Charlemagne's court poets knew a ruler needed more than armies. He needed symbols that blurred the line between man and myth. Joyeuse, whether real or imagined, became that symbol, a blade sharp enough to cut history into two edges, one of fact, the other of faith. And in that divide, it still gleams, daring us to ask whether the greatest weapons are those that live not in scabbards, but in the stories we can't stop retelling. Charlemagne's treasure hoard wasn't just gold and jewels. It was the physical embodiment of his empire's might, a legend wrapped in whispers and riddles. Chronicles speak of wagonloads of Saxon plunder, Avar gold melted down into Frankish coins, and priceless relics like the Holy Lance of Longinus, all locked away in palace vaults. Yet by the 9th century, these riches had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only tantalizing hints. Some claim Viking raiders carried off the bulk of it during their relentless attacks on Frankish monasteries. Others believe Charlemagne himself hid portions in remote abbeys, a sacred trust meant to protect his legacy from greedy heirs. The truth, it's a detective story written in blood and parchment. Take the Viking theory. Norse sagas boast of a legendary raid on the Frisian coast in 810, where warriors breached a fortified chapel said to hold the golden hoard of Karl the Great. The annals of St. Bertin describe longships so overloaded with treasure, their prows dipped perilously low in the water. But here's the twist: archaeologists recently found Viking burial sites in Norway crammed with Frankish silver deniers minted under Charlemagne, their edges nicked from hasty division. These coins match records from the palace treasury at Aachen, suggesting at least some loot did sail north. Yet the sagas also speak of a cursed ruby chalice stolen that day, one that brought death to any Viking who touched it. Was this a twisted echo of Charlemagne's own relic collection, or pure myth? Then there's the monastery trail. In 1863, a farmer ploughing near the ruins of Corby Abbey unearthed a clay pot brimming with gold solidi, coins bearing Charlemagne's profile. Over 200 pieces, nearly flawless, as if freshly struck and buried in haste. Historians noticed something peculiar. These coins predated his imperial coronation, yet bore the title Carolus Imperator. A secret mint, a failed bid for legitimacy before the Pope's endorsement. Even stranger, the hoard included 3 blank gold discs, their edges inscribed with Greek letters matching a cipher used by Byzantine spies. Were these payment for informants or part of some lost diplomatic exchange with Empress Irene? The most compelling clue lies in the Abbey of St. Maurice d'Agorn, where Charlemagne made lavish donations after his Lombard victory. Medieval inventories list a crown of iron and light, later crossed out, likely the very Lombard crown he took from Desiderius. But when scholars searched the abbey's crypts in 1891, they found only an empty reliquary with a single word scratched inside: redibit, it will return. Was this a monk's hopeful prayer, or a clue to a treasure still waiting to be found? Perhaps the real secret isn't the gold itself, but what it represented. Charlemagne's hoard wasn't merely wealth, it was the glue of his empire, used to reward loyalty, buy off enemies, and sanctify his rule. Every stolen coin, every melted-down relic carries a fragment of that story, one where power and piety were forever intertwined, and where even the greatest treasures could vanish into the fog of time, leaving only legends behind. History is often written by the victors, but in Charlemagne's case, it may have been rewritten by his scribes. Behind the illuminated manuscripts and carefully penned chronicles lies a quiet scandal, evidence that Carolingian scholars systematically doctored records to burnish their emperor's legacy. The discrepancies start small. Battle dates shifted to downplay defeats, enemy numbers inflated to make victories seem grander, but dig deeper and the cracks widen into chasms. Take the Royal Frankish Annals, the official account of Charlemagne's reign. Its description of the Saxon Wars paints a picture of swift, decisive triumphs. Yet archaeology tells a different story. Mass graves along the Weser River, filled with Frankish soldiers bearing wounds from prolonged combat, suggest years of grinding stalemates erased from the record. Even more damning, carbon-dated spearheads found in Saxon villages match Frankish forges, but from years before the annals claim Charlemagne's armies first marched north. Were these unauthorized raids scrubbed from history to preserve the image of a just, disciplined conqueror? The manipulation grows bolder when we compare multiple sources. Einhard's biography, Life of Charlemagne, omits entire rebellions documented in regional monastic diaries. The revolt of Hardrad in 785, where Bavarian nobles nearly overthrew Frankish rule, vanishes without a trace. So does the mysterious Night of the Long Knives in 803, referenced in a lone Breton scroll, a purge of aristocratic families who resisted tax reforms. Most telling is the handling of Charlemagne's family. The Lorsch Codex lists 12 children, while later Vatican copies reduce it to 8, excising names like Adalhaid and Huadhaid, whose marriages to rival dynasties might have complicated succession. But the real smoking gun lies in the ink itself. Spectral imaging of the Muspili manuscript, a 9th century religious poem, reveals layers of scratched-out verses beneath the surface. Original lines condemning the king who breaks oaths were overwritten with praises for the emperor's divine wisdom. Chemical analysis pinpoints the alterations to scriptoriums under royal patronage, their pigments matching exclusive court supplies. This wasn't haphazard editing, it was state-sponsored revisionism. Why go to such lengths? Because Charlemagne understood what all great rulers know: control the past and you control the future. By airbrushing setbacks, inflating piety, and silencing dissent, his scribes didn't just record history, they weaponized it. The parchment trail left to us is less an archive than a hall of mirrors, where every reflection bends toward the same dazzling illusion, the perfect Christian king. The question isn't whether the records were altered, but whether we'll ever glimpse the man behind the ink-stained curtain. The paradox of Charlemagne's sainthood lingers like incense in a darkened chapel. How could a man who ordered the slaughter of thousands at Verden, who twisted faith into a weapon of conquest, be elevated to the altars of the church? The answer lies in the gulf between medieval and modern morality, where sanctity and power danced in ways that unsettle our contemporary conscience. Officially canonized in 1165 by the antipope Paschal III, a move later ratified by Rome, Charlemagne's sainthood wasn't the culmination of his life's piety, but a chess move in a much older game. Look closer at the timing. Paschal's decree came at the height of the investiture controversy, when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was locked in a bitter struggle with the papacy over who had the right to appoint bishops. By sanctifying Charlemagne, Frederick wasn't just honoring a dead ruler, he was weaponizing his legacy. Here was proof that emperors, not popes, were the true defenders of Christendom, their authority divinely ordained. The message was clear: if the church could make saints, emperors could claim them as their own. Yet politics alone don't explain the grassroots cult that had simmered for centuries. In Aachen, locals whispered of miracles at Charlemagne's tomb. Sick children healed after touching his sarcophagus, soldiers spared in battle after invoking his name. These stories, whether pious fabrications or genuine fervor, reveal something deeper: medieval Europe's hunger for a patron who embodied both sanctity and strength. To peasants harried by Viking raids or nobles defending crumbling borders, Charlemagne wasn't just a historical figure, he was a shield. His sins, like the bloodshed at Verden, were reframed as holy violence, the grim necessities of a spiritual warrior. The Church's own ambivalence speaks volumes. For 3 centuries after his death, Rome resisted calls for canonization, uneasy with canonizing a ruler who divorced wives and waged wars of conversion. Even the official hagiography, the Vita Caroli Magni, treads carefully, praising his church building while glossing over massacres with phrases like correcting errors in faith. The compromise: Charlemagne was made a cultus confirmed saint venerable, but lacking the universal veneration of apostles or martyrs, a saint for empire builders, not theologians. Perhaps the most revealing clue lies in the art of the period. Medieval frescoes often depict Charlemagne not with a halo, but with a sword, one hand gripping the cross, the other a bloodied blade. This duality captures the medieval mind's comfort with contradiction, a saint who could be both shepherd and conqueror so long as his violence served Christendom. In the end, his canonization wasn't about absolving his sins but sanctifying the system he built, one where faith and empire were forever entwined, and where the road to heaven sometimes ran through rivers of pagan blood. Centuries after his death, Charlemagne's legend took on a life of its own, transforming from historical emperor to messianic figure in the fevered imaginations of medieval prophets. One of the most striking examples is the Last Emperor prophecy, a Byzantine Christian tradition that wove Charlemagne into the tapestry of apocalyptic lore. According to these texts, a great emperor would rise from the West in the end times, a savior who would reunite Christendom, defeat the Antichrist, and lay down his crown in Jerusalem before the Second Coming. By the 12th century, scribes across Europe were retrofitting Charlemagne into this role, portraying him not just as a conqueror, but as a divine herald whose reign foreshadowed the final days. What makes this reinterpretation so fascinating is how it twisted history to fit prophecy. Chronicles began circulating tales of Charlemagne's supposed journey to Jerusalem, where the patriarch gifted him relics of Christ's passion, a story with no basis in historical fact, yet one that cemented his image as a sacred warrior. Even his failures were rewritten as mystical signs. The Roncevaux ambush, where Basque fighters slaughtered his rearguard, became a cosmic trial, with Roland's death reimagined as a martyrdom that purified Charlemagne's mission. Manuscript illuminations from this period show the emperor not in battle, but kneeling before angels, receiving a celestial sword destined to cleanse the world of evil. But the most disturbing chapter of this myth-making came in the 20th century, when Nazi ideologues dredged up Charlemagne's legend for their own twisted purposes. Heinrich Himmler's Onanub research branch latched onto the last emperor trope, framing Charlemagne as an Aryan archetype, a Germanic ruler whose forced conversion of the Saxons became a blueprint for racial purity. They ignored his alliances with Jewish merchants and his reliance on multicultural scholars, instead painting him as a ruthless unifier who purged Europe of inferior influences. This grotesque distortion reached its peak in wartime propaganda, where SS recruitment posters superimposed Charlemagne's likeness over maps of a Nazi-dominated continent, his crown morphed into a swastika. The irony is staggering. The same man who built his empire on a fragile balance of faith and pragmatism became a puppet in ideological wars he could never have foreseen. Medieval monks saw him as a saint, Nazis recast him as a fascist, yet neither interpretation captures the real Charlemagne, a leader who understood power as fluid, who could massacre Saxons one year and patronize Jewish communities the next. Perhaps that's the danger of prophecy. It simplifies history into myth, stripping away the messy contradictions that make human beings, even emperors, impossible to reduce to a single story. The legend of Charlemagne endures not because it's true, but because it's endlessly malleable, a mirror reflecting whatever each era fears or desires most. The mystery of Charlemagne's bones is a forensic puzzle wrapped in medieval intrigue. In 2014, scientists finally secured permission to analyze a sliver of bone long venerated as his relic, a rib housed in Aachen's treasury. The results sent shockwaves through historical circles. Traces of arsenic and mercury, toxins favored by medieval assassins, lurked in the fibers. Was this evidence of foul play or something more mundane? Arsenic was used in embalming and mercury in medicinal salves, leaving researchers divided. But the plot thickens. When a team requested access to the golden reliquary that supposedly holds Charlemagne's skull, church officials abruptly denied testing, citing sacred inviolability. The refusal sparked fierce debate. Were they protecting holy remains or hiding inconvenient truths? Even the skeleton at the heart of Charlemagne's tomb raises questions. The remains, first examined in the 1860s, belong to a tall, robust man consistent with Einhard's description of the emperor's imposing stature. Yet the skull shows a healed fracture above the left eyebrow, a detail absent from historical accounts of his injuries. More puzzling still, DNA extracted from the femurs in 2018 revealed haplogroup E1b1b, rare among Germanic elites but common in Mediterranean populations. Some scholars suggest contamination over centuries of handling. Others whisper of a darker possibility, that these aren't Charlemagne's bones at all, but a decoy planted during the chaotic Viking raids that plundered Aachen's treasures. The relic trade of the Middle Ages further clouds the picture. After his canonization, Charlemagne's remains were dismembered and dispersed across Europe as sacred objects. A finger bone in Prague, a tooth in Vienna, even a fragment of pelvis in Paris, each accompanied by lavish legends, but radiocarbon dating tells a different story. The Vienna tooth, for instance, dates 300 years too late. Even the famed arm reliquary in Bust Abbey, once paraded through Flanders to cure plague victims, contains bones from multiple individuals. This patchwork of fragments exposes an uncomfortable truth. The cult of saints often prioritized spiritual power over scientific accuracy, assembling relics like sacred jigsaw puzzles. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue lies in what hasn't been found. Despite centuries of searching, no forensic study has located the emperor's heart or intestines, organs typically removed during elite medieval embalming. A 9th-century monk's chronicle mentions their burial in a separate lead casket beneath Aachen's choir, yet excavations have turned up nothing. Were these visceral relics quietly destroyed during the Reformation's iconoclasm, or do they wait still, hidden in some forgotten crypt? Until science is allowed to weigh all the evidence, Charlemagne's physical legacy will remain as fragmented as the empire he built, a collection of contradictions where faith and fact refuse to align. Charlemagne's colossal shadow stretches far beyond the dusty pages of history. It looms large in the realms of pop culture, often twisted and reshaped to fit modern narratives. Take the Civilization video game series where he appears as a playable leader, his traits simplified into neat game mechanics, bonus combat strength for defending the faith, reflecting his crusading image. But this digital caricature smooths over the contradictions of the real man, a ruler who could weep over ancient texts one moment and order mass executions the next. Even his in-game dialogue, pulled from Einhard's chronicles, paints him as a pious idealist, erasing the political cunning that secured his throne. Games like Crusader Kings go further, reducing his reign to a sandbox of conquest and dynastic scheming where players can rewrite history with a few clicks. The irony, these versions often feel more real to audiences than the complex historical figure, proving how easily legends eclipse truth. Then there's the darker appropriation neo-pagan and far-right groups weaponizing Charlemagne as a symbol of cultural erasure. Online forums seethe with claims he genocided Saxon paganism, framing him as a medieval villain who crushed Germanic identity under the cross. This narrative ignores his pragmatic integration of Saxon elites and preservation of local laws, but it thrives in corners of the internet where history is flattened into tribal allegories. The twisted twist, some of these same groups ironically borrow Carolingian imagery, the imperial eagle, the sword joyeuse, to suit their myths, oblivious to the fact that Charlemagne himself relied on Jewish advisors and Muslim envoys. It's a reminder that the past is always a battleground, and few figures are as fiercely contested as this Frankish king. Yet perhaps the most surreal tribute lies in the Charlemagne industry that fuels medieval tourism. In Aachen, visitors can sip beer from replica Carolingian mugs, attend light shows projecting his face onto the cathedral, even buy emperor's crown chocolates wrapped in gold foil. The city's annual Karlspreis Awards, celebrating European unity, invoke his ghost as a proto-EU visionary, a far cry from the man who forged unity through conquest. Museums display fragments of his throne alongside touchscreen exhibits, blending relics with augmented reality. Is this reverence or commodification? The line blurs when you spot a Charlemagne brand of Belgian waffles, their logo a cartoonish crown. What these portrayals share is a hunger for simplicity, a Charlemagne stripped of ambiguity, molded into whatever hero or villain a generation needs. The real man defies such easy labels. He was neither the saintly monarch of medieval hagiography nor the brute of neo-pagan lore, but something far more human. A ruler who wielded faith and fear in equal measure, whose legacy is as fractured and contested as the empire he built. The next time you encounter him in a game, a meme, or a souvenir shop, listen closely. Behind the distortion, you might just hear the whisper of a more complicated truth. Charlemagne's legacy isn't a monolith, it's a mosaic of contradictions that refuse to settle into a single image. Here was a man who stitched together fractured kingdoms under one banner, yet whose policies planted the seeds for Europe's future divisions. He forced unity at sword point in Saxony, then preserved local laws in Bavaria. He patronized scholars to revive classical learning while burning pagan groves to the ground. Even his sainthood feels like a paradox bestowed on a ruler who wielded faith as both shield and weapon, who ordered mass baptisms with one hand and signed death warrants with the other. The empire he built didn't just elevate Christianity, it entangled it with power so completely that the two became indistinguishable, a fusion that would shape Europe's wars and politics for centuries. The deeper we dig, the more the lines blur between visionary and tyrant. His coronation as emperor didn't just resurrect a title, it rewrote the rules of legitimacy, making the church a kingmaker and kings into divinely anointed figures. But was this a rebirth of Roman glory or a masterstroke of propaganda? The same ruler who wept over Virgil's poetry also manipulated chronicles to erase his failures, ensuring history would remember his triumphs while burying his bloodiest compromises. His court at Aachen became a stage where scholars, warriors, and clergy played their parts in a grand performance of piety and power, all carefully orchestrated to cement his legend. Perhaps the most telling contradiction lies in his family. The man who preached Christian virtue exiled his own son to a monastery, kept daughters unwed as political pawns, and watched as his carefully planned succession collapsed into fratricidal chaos. The empire he spent a lifetime building fractured within generations, yet his name endured not as a warning but as an ideal. Medieval kings copied his seals, Napoleon donned his crown, and modern Europe invokes him as a unifying symbol, even as scholars wrestle with the brutality beneath the guilt. So was Charlemagne history's greatest ruler or its most cunning propagandist? The answer might lie in the question itself. He was both a leader who understood that to shape the future, you must first control the story. His genius wasn't just in conquest or governance, but in making his vision so compelling that even his contradictions became part of the myth. 12 centuries later, we're still trying to untangle the man from the legend, left to wonder whether the real Charlemagne was the one who ruled or the one he convinced us to remember. So was Charlemagne truly the father of Europe, or is that title more myth than reality? The question lingers like smoke over a battlefield. On one hand, his conquests stitched together fractured kingdoms, forging a political blueprint that would echo through the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. His courts revived learning, preserving classical texts that might otherwise have been lost to the Dark Ages. But zoom in and the cracks appear. The empire fractured within generations of his death, his own family tearing apart what he'd built. His brutal Saxon campaigns and calculated purges of rivals reveal a ruler who valued unity, but often at the cost of mercy. Here's where you come in. History isn't just about dates and decrees, it's a conversation. Did Charlemagne plant the seeds of European identity, or was he simply a warlord who got good press? Did his cultural renaissance justify the bloodshed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear whether you see him as a visionary or a conqueror wrapped in scripture. And if you love peeling back the layers of medieval mysteries like this, don't forget to subscribe. Every click of that bell takes you deeper into the shadows of history, where the truth is always stranger than the legend.